Good morning. Good
Hello.
evening to you.
Everything is working, you're live, and you can take it away, Franziska.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation to be here. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm glad we can at least connect in this way. So again, I'm Franziska Rösner. I am an associate professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington in Seattle. So it's morning here. And I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab. And as you heard, our focus in this lab is really broadly on computer security and privacy topics, understanding current technologies, anticipating future technologies, thinking about technical systems, but also thinking about people and what they need and how they interact with technologies. One of the lines of work that we have been doing over the last 10 years or so, like many of you, has been studying the online advertising ecosystem. And we've looked at that now from a variety of different angles. And, I think the venue here, many of us think about all of these different topics, ranging from the privacy concerns associated with tracking that supports online advertising, potential implications from targeting, the way that that private data is used, but also the way that potentially vulnerable individuals can be targeted with ads. And more recently in our lab, we have been studying the user-facing content of these ads. And so that's what this talk is about. And I hope I will both show you some interesting examples, but also convince you that the problematic content in these ads is an issue and something that we should be thinking about in addition to the underlying technical mechanisms of the advertisements. In my research community, the security and privacy research community, our work and others has focused a lot on these underlying technical mechanisms of the targeted advertising ecosystem. So considering the privacy concerns with tracking and targeting and so on. And all of this work has really been mostly agnostic to what the actual content is of those advertisements. There's been some work looking at the use of advertisements to distribute malware or exploits, but the user-facing content, like you see in this slide, is something that we haven't really studied systematically previously. And so this has been the core of our research focus over the last few years, understanding what is the user visible content of ads and what is potentially problematic there and what's going on in that ecosystem. So to motivate this a little bit further, this started in part, this research direction, not just based on our prior work in ads, but some work that we've been doing related to online misinformation and disinformation. And one of our observations, kind of bringing these two areas together, is that a lot of the work in the mis and disinformation space is really focused on content that we see on low quality or misinformation news websites or on social media, kind of first party content. But one of our observations is that much of the content that users actually see on the web, if they're not using an ad blocker, consists of advertisements. And these advertisements are often hard to distinguish from the news content that they see on the same pages. So here's a screenshot just to make this visual. This is a screenshot of some news site, and the top two articles are articles on that site. And below, I think probably this audience is skilled at recognizing these things, but below there's this feed of advertisements that are labeled as sponsored, but otherwise use roughly the same styling as the rest of the articles. And there's been plenty of work in other fields also studying the detectability of these ads. So how good are people at identifying this content as ads? And by design, people are not so good at distinguishing this from primary content. So this has been our core observation, that not only is this content hard to distinguish from first-party content for many users, it also just frankly makes up a large fraction of the content that people see on the web. So if we think about the web as an information platform where people are getting news, they're getting health advice, they're getting all sorts of crucial things. A lot of the content that they see in practice is in ads. And I think when we're thinking about this type of content, it can sometimes be easy to think of ads as this secondary thing that's not primary to what users are seeing, but it really makes up a large fraction of the real estate of many of these sites. So our research questions around this have been kind of threefold. First of all, conceptualizing what problematic content actually appears in ads and what makes it problematic. And I'll show you a few examples on the next slide, but we sort of see a spectrum of different types of content ranging from things that are, clearly bad, I would say, like outright scams, to things that are more distasteful and maybe would not be considered problematic by everyone. So we've been trying to wrap our minds around this spectrum of content and whether and how one can draw a line somewhere. As part of that, it's important, of course, to understand users' perceptions. So I'll talk a bit about what we've learned from asking users directly about these ads. And then the bulk of our research has been on web measurement. So understanding what type of problematic content is prevalent in ads in the wild, how prevalent are these types of ads, who is creating and distributing these ads, and on what websites are they appearing. So what do I mean by problematic content? You might have some ideas in your mind, but let me show you a few examples. So on the one hand, we have advertisements that are advertisements, but are poorly disclosed as such. So these are things like insurance advertorials, investment pitches, product advertorials that look often like news article headlines. And even the underlying news article, when you click on it, looks like a news article. We've even seen cases where the sites on which these articles appear are using logos from legitimate news sites. And are sometimes disclosed as advertorials, but often not very clearly. We also see plenty of low quality content that is trying to hook people with some shocking story and then ultimately just distribute more and more ads to them on these low quality content farm pages. We see similar types of ads on particular topics, like especially on medical topics. We see a lot of low quality, unverified supplement ads and other things where you can start to imagine that the harms from these ads might be more than just wasting somebody's time by going to a low quality website, but potentially actually impacting their health decisions. We also see some things that are a bit more traditionally computer security concerns, like potentially unwanted software ads that make it seem as though you have to click on the button to download the browser extension. And who knows what all these browser extensions do. That's something that we actually have not studied yet. That would be very interesting to look into. But using kind of these manipulative design patterns or dark patterns to trick people into downloading software. There's also a big category of clickbait ads that overlap with mis and disinformation. And I'll talk a bit more about these later in the talk, but I find these particularly interesting because on the one hand, they're in a gray area. They're often not making falsifiable statements. Like this one is one of my favorite examples. It says there's a viral video that exposes something fishy in Biden's speeches. And I'll talk a bit more when I talk about our study of political ads in the 2020 US elections about why I think this is such a problematic category of ad. And then finally, we see plenty of dark pattern manipulative design style ads, like these ads that look like polls or otherwise trick people into clicking or convince them that they need to click. And users may think they're doing something else, but in fact, they're clicking on the ad. So you see all of these different examples, and we could have a debate, of course, about how bad these different examples are and what we should do about them. But I think one of our observations in this work has been that there is, frankly, a lot of this type of content in the ad ecosystem, and there's a spectrum of potential harms from it, ranging from traditional computer security risks from unwanted and untrustworthy software, all the way to clickbait that is wasting people's time, but that is really lowering the quality of information that people are getting on the web. So our initial work focused on our own researcher-based analysis of ads that we collected in a measurement study, which led us to pose our initial research questions and identify these categories. But of course, one thing we really wanted to understand is not just what do we as researchers think, but what do users actually think, and do they also agree that these types of ads are problematic? So we ran a study a couple of years ago where we asked users about their preferences on ads in a couple of different stages. The first question was simply understanding the reasons why users like or dislike ads. So we selected a set of 30 ads from our previous measurement study, spanning what we thought was the spectrum of, high quality, well-disclosed product ad, all the way to these types of unwanted software scam downloads. And we find a range of user likes and dislikes that align with, perhaps what you would expect. But I'll build on this in the next slide. So, people dislike ads just because they are poorly designed, they're boring or irrelevant to the user, they're unclear. We see a set of ads that users are uncomfortable with. They find them distasteful or offensive. They find them too politicized. So we see examples like this, where there's a clickbait ad where there's some sort of gross image or an image that seems gross on first look, even if when you look at it more closely, it's actually something benign. So users react really viscerally to these types of gross ads. And this visceral reaction is, by design, but users don't like this reaction. And then we find ads that are, further on the spectrum that users viewed as deceptive and untrustworthy. So, for example, some of these stock ads, investment pitches, set off the alarm bells for users, thinking that this seems like a scam and like it's not from a reputable source, and so on. So this part of the study gave us this set of reasons that participants disliked ads. And what we then wanted to do is classify ads, cluster ads according to these preferences. So then we did a much larger survey with 1,000 participants, where we had each participant label 10 ads from our measurement study and label it with these labels that we developed in the first part of the study. So we randomly sampled ads from a crawl of the top 3,000 global websites. And then based on the participant labels, we clustered the ads and found 13 thematically distinct clusters of those ads, which we then further manually analyzed to characterize ourselves. So let me give you two examples, the clusters that were most disliked by our participants. On the one side, we have these scammy and untrustworthy ads, and the label distribution here tells you the fraction of ads and participants that participants labeled with these labels that again came from the original study. So here's where we see the ads that are primarily viewed as deceptive and as clickbait as well. So that's where we see these investment pitches, these kind of health and supplement ads, software downloads, and so on. Then we have the distasteful and gross ads, which are overlapping thematically, but came out in this distinct cluster, which is more focused on clickbait and these distasteful ads that are trying to evoke this strong emotional reaction. It might be something that's disgusting. It might be sexual. It's a lot of human interest, celebrity news, clickbait, and so on. So one thing we found is that, perhaps unsurprisingly, participants, on the one hand, agreed roughly with our concerns about problematic ads, but participants did not all necessarily agree with each other. So it seems there's some degree of personal preference in what is across some line and what is not. I'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, so let me move on to talking a bit about our measurement results. So the first thing we want to know, of course, is how prevalent are ads in these different categories? And the short answer is these ads are quite prevalent. We can look at this in two different measurements. So one is looking at this set of 3,000 websites, the random sample of ads that we had participants label. How did these ads look overall? These same labels that I mentioned before. And we see that 20% of the ads were labeled by at least 50% of the participants who labeled them as clickbait. And over 10% of them were labeled as deceptive. And again, this was a random sample of these ads. So whether these percentages are higher or lower than you might expect, it's clearly a large fraction of what folks are seeing when they browse the web. We did another study where we used labels that we as researchers applied to the ads, where we did a lot of qualitative content analysis of the ads. And here what we were looking at is ads on top news sites, reputable news sites, and ads on top known misinformation or lower quality news sites. And the results here were actually really surprising to us because we went into the study expecting to see that there would be more problematic ads on the misinformation sites. The hypothesis was that maybe these misinformation sites pull users into a rabbit hole and they see worse and worse content as they go down this rabbit hole. But in fact, what we found is that these problematic ads appear nearly as frequently on the top news sites. So this is breaking down ads appearing on the homepages of these sites and ads appearing on the underlying article pages of these sites. And we see that nearly half of the ads were labeled as problematic under one of our researcher created categories. So again, this is just a huge fraction of the content that people are seeing on the web. We can then also look at where are these ads coming from, who's serving them. And for those of you who know this ecosystem, you'll probably not be surprised to know that many of these ads come from these native ad platforms like Taboola and Outbrain. And we see that these platforms served a much higher volume of the problematic ads than other platforms that focus more on kind of traditional display ads. And not only is it a higher volume and looking just at the number of ads that are served, but also a much higher fraction of the ads served through these native ad platforms are problematic. In some cases, up to 100% of the ads are basically this type of manipulative clickbait. And so it's worth distinguishing this from Google here, where many of the problematic ads we saw are also served through Google's ad platform. But of course, Google serves a huge number of ads. So the fraction of ads served through Google that's problematic is much lower than for these native ad platforms. There's also the question of where do these problematic ads appear? And as I mentioned, I think a big finding for us initially that was surprising is that they appear significantly on both news and misinformation websites. And so in other words, this ad ecosystem is supporting financially all of these different sites, and sites are not necessarily making distinctions based on the quality of their own content. But one thing to note is that these ads are nevertheless not distributed equally. So looking just at the top 100 reputable news sites, about half of them served problematic ads in our measurements. A few served no ads at all, and then about half of them served no problematic ads, so only higher quality, well-disclosed display ads and so on. So the distributions here are actually quite skewed. So I've talked about some general measurements in our understanding of users, but one case study that I wanted to talk about in particular was around the US elections in 2020. So at this point, we had set up our ad measurement infrastructure. We had done the study of user perceptions. We had done our qualitative content analysis as researchers. And we were in the position to be able to collect and analyze ads around the US elections. So here we were looking at ads appearing on websites, so not social media ads. So some of these findings complement and give us the bigger picture of the advertising ecosystem, along with other work that you've heard about looking at the Facebook ads and so on. So over 6 weeks, approximately before and after the US elections in the fall of 2020, we collected 1.5 million ads from about 800 news and media websites, including some of those low quality and misinformation sites. Of those ads, we built a political ad classifier. We trained a political ad classifier, and about 56,000 of them were politically themed. And one thing I'll emphasize here is that we took a broad definition of what is a political ad. So looking not only at official campaign ads or things that would appear, say, in Google's or Facebook's ad transparency platforms, but also things that were leveraging political themes in some way. So including clickbait that mentioned political themes, but would not officially be labeled as a political ad by some of these platforms. So we found a spectrum of ads with arguably problematic content along the lines that I've shown you, including many of these misleading political polls, so this sort of manipulative design pattern that looks like a poll. It's leveraging people's political motivations, asking them to click. And when you click, you are redirected, of course, to the ad landing page, and also often asked for your email address or other contact information to finalize your vote, in which case you may be signed up for a mailing list that continues to push problematic content on you, as we've seen in other studies. We also see a lot of political product ads, some of which are unproblematic, but many of which fall into this gray area of feeling kind of scammy, this bait and switch pattern where you might get something for free with a large shipping and handling fee, and often targeting kind of US right-leaning, especially Trump-related paraphernalia during this period. And then finally, there is this category of political clickbait, which we saw a significant amount of. And I mentioned that I would come back to this. Again, these are ads that are not official political ads. They're really just the ad ecosystem taking advantage of the topics of interest of the day, and using these classic clickbait styles of sensational headlines, leaving out information that makes you curious and want to click. Often we looked at the underlying articles for some of these, including this one. The underlying articles contain very little substance, and often don't really back up the implication of the original headline. And I find these to be very slippery. You know, they're not directly falsifiable, so it's hard to argue that you should take these down on those grounds. But they are a significant part, again, of what people are seeing as they are browsing the web leading up to the election, and it's contributing to their perception of trustworthiness of candidates. Like, you know, in this case, the something fishy in Biden's speeches contributes to this narrative that there's something untrustworthy about Joe Biden. And people may not even identify these as ads. They may not later remember that they saw them as ads and just remember, you know, I keep seeing there's something untrustworthy about this candidate. And so I find this category personally really problematic because it kind of slides under the radar in being not explicitly problematic. It's not really a computer security exploit. You can't go after this in the same way, but it likely has really problematic impacts and contributing to you know the low quality of our overall information ecosystem. I'll show one last example from this case study. This is one of my favorites. This is actually an official ad from the Republican National Committee that was running in Georgia. And it looks like, you know, an old Windows dialogue. And I don't know if this is a joke or if this is intended to manipulate people, maybe older people who are still using older operating systems. I don't know what the intention here is, but I think it's just a really nice example of you know, the types of manipulative design patterns that come together here. So in the last few minutes, let me sum up what we've learned so far and also leave you with some what I think is our call to action here. So we see this spectrum of problematic ad content ranging from things that are clearly problematic to things that maybe not all users agree are problematic, and maybe you don't agree are problematic. But we see a significant amount of all of this content in ads appearing on websites, around half of the ad content that we see in some of our measurements. These problematic ads often appear in native ads, so they go together with this problematic design pattern of ads that are designed not to look like ads, and they're concentrated among certain ad networks. But they appear across many different types of websites, including mainstream media sites, misinformation sites, and across at least the US political spectrum. And then, as I mentioned, we see that people have varying perceptions of these ads, but nevertheless, there are some clusters of problematic ads that emerge from user opinions, especially around deceptive ads or emotionally charged, viscerally emotionally triggering ads. So where does that leave us? What should or can we do about all of this? I think the biggest thing that I hope you take away from this talk is that we need to be thinking about ad content as an important part of what we think about when we think about ads, and an important part of what we think about when we think about our online information ecosystem. So when we think about online mis and disinformation, thinking about these ads not just as potential funders of primary content, but also contributing to this type of problematic information that people see in the first place. I think there's a lot of room still to better understand the impacts of these problematic ads. We've asked for users' opinions about their their emotional reaction to them, essentially. And we have some hypotheses about the impacts. I've explained why I dislike these political clickbait ads, for example, but I think there's more scientific work to be done to really demonstrate and document these impacts on different users. So in terms of time or attention or emotional reaction or political opinion or subsequent behaviors or decisions around health and so on. There's also, of course, especially in the context of our venue here, supporting end users both in understanding this type of content, that it is ads, what its potential impacts are, or filtering this type of content. And again, there may be some personalized filtering that is valuable here, as users have different preferences on the spectrum of problematic content. And ultimately, I think our work and related work is really important in providing increased transparency about what's going on in this huge ecosystem where users see different things and so on. And so providing transparency for users and regulators about this type of content and putting pressures on advertisers, publishers, and ad platforms to think about the potential impacts of this problematic content, both emotionally, intellectually, and so on. So I will stop there. I know I can't take questions synchronously, but I would be more than happy to hear from you. I'm on the Slack, so please ask me questions there, or you can reach out to me via my email address or anything else I've put up here. Thank you again so much for the invitation, and I hope I'll see some of you in person soon.